Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Monk School of Global Affairs. My name is Stephen Toop, and I have the honor to serve as director of the Monk School of Global Affairs. And this is always one of the highlights of the year in the Monk School, the wonderful partnership we have with the Lionel Gelber Foundation and with Foreign Policy Magazine, which enables us to offer the Lionel Gelber Prize. You'll hear more about that briefly, and then to welcome the winner of the prize each year to speak here in Toronto. And this year, I can say that we have managed to pick a jury that, in my view, picked an absolutely superb book that is not only a great read, but also speaks to some of the most important issues of our time, tying together a range of issues in a way that is really quite remarkable, and we'll hear more about that, so I'll stop. But I want to welcome all of the members of the Charney family, the trustees of the Lionel Gelber Prize. We're very honored to partner with you in offering this prize, and it is my distinct pleasure to invite Sarah Charney, who's chair of the Gelber Foundation board, to say a few words about Lionel Gelber and the prize. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Stephen. As president of the Lionel Gelber Foundation and chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize Board, I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to the 26th Lionel Gelber Prize Awards ceremony. Many thanks to each of you for joining us here this evening. For the past several years, the prize has enjoyed the benefit of distinguished oversight and polished management by both the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and Foreign Policy Magazine in Washington, who work in partnership with members of Lionel Gelber's family on both the Lionel Gelber Foundation and the Lionel Gelber Prize Board. Professor Stephen Toop, director of the Monk School of Global Affairs, has become a fast friend of the Gelber family, and in a few short years has become a passionate advocate for the Gelber Prize. The Gelber Prize Board is indeed fortunate to have Stephen at its helm, championing the prize both here at the University of Toronto and abroad. Thank you, Stephen, for your support, and most importantly, for your understanding of the makings, the retention, and the promotion of a global prize. Indeed, it is due to Stephen's outreach that Focus Asset Management joined the prize team as our new media partner, which generously funds the Lionel Gelber Prize podcast series. The series features in-depth conversations with each of this year's finalists, with interviewer Rob Steiner, Director of Fellowships in Global Journalism at the Monk School. I would also like to acknowledge the superb work of June Dickinson. June's methodical, timely, and exhaustive outreach extends to all media. One would be hard-pressed to not read about the prize in print, listen to an interview over the airwaves, on Twitter, or on Facebook. But the critical work is undoubtedly performed by our jury. It is their selections over the years of the book deemed best of the year in English on global affairs that ensure the prize's continuing prestige and renown. In setting up the prize, my father Arthur stipulated, we set up rules and evaluation procedures to make the jurors aware that fresh ideas have to be there, but that too much obscurity would disqualify authors for the award. Lionel always wrote simply. It is the objective of the prize to augment the audience for and appreciation of international relations. Accordingly, works of interest to a general as well as a scholarly public in this field will be eligible for the prize. Finally, I would like to make note that 2016 is the 15th year anniversary of the partnership between the Lionel Gelber Prize and the University of Toronto, specifically the Monk School. My sister Nance Gelber was chair of the prize board at the time, and Professor Janice Stein, director of the Monk School for International Affairs, as it was then called, was its chair. Here were some of the stated objectives for creating the partnership in 2001. The Lionel Gelber Prize, which seeks to deepen public debate on significant global issues by broadening the readership of important books, has joined with the Monk Center for International Studies at Trinity College and the University of Toronto. The new partnership is a natural. The book prize now has an international reputation, which requires a forward-thinking infrastructure to nourish its future. The Monk Center, steeped in academic excellence and situated in heritage buildings on campus, is a leader in employing sophisticated communication technology to bring the world to its programs. 15 years later, we still hold fast to those principles. On behalf of the Lionel Gelber Prize Board, namely Professor Stephen Toop, Professor Ron Levy, my sister Patty Rubin, and my nephews Gerald and Noah Rubin, welcome, and we trust that you will enjoy the event.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and I must say that it is an unreserved delight to work with the prize board and through them with the foundation. It's now an honor to introduce to you the members of the jury. They're not all here, sadly, because you will see that they come from all over the world and have done, as I said earlier, a wonderful job. The first member was Rachel Lomax, who's a British economist, a former government official in the United Kingdom who served as the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. And she was also the World Bank's first female deputy. She went on to become an independent non-executive director of HSBC Holdings and is a director of the Royal National Theatre. And I can say from having spoken with her, an utterly engaging and charming person. Matthias Spector is a professor of international relations at the Getúlio Vargas, which is a foundation in Brazil. He writes regularly on foreign policy for Brazil's leading newspaper, and he founded and directed the Center for International Relations at the foundation. He's the first occupant of the chair of Rio Branco at King's College London and was the first Global South Fellow at the London School of Economics. Also a very charming man. David Malone is a famous Canadian author and diplomat, former Undersecretary General of the United Nations, rector of the United Nations University, also served as president of the International Peace Institute in New York and the International Development Research Center in Ottawa. Many diplomatic appointments, ambassador and deputy permanent representative of Canada to the UN was but one. David is a great friend of the Monk School and has participated in many ways in our programming. Michael Barnett is a distinguished scholar of international relations, currently serving as University Professor of International Affairs and Political Science at the George Washington University, the Elliott School of International Affairs. He writes about international organizations, international relations theory, and Mideast politics. In fact, he has a new book that just came out, in which he introduced here only a couple of weeks ago, on the foreign policy of American Jews. A fascinating, fascinating book. Finally, the chair of the very distinguished jury this year is John Stackhouse, currently serving as the Royal Bank of Canada's, or RBC's, Senior Vice President in the Office of the Chief Executive Officer. Previously, as many of you will know, National Editor, Foreign Editor, Correspondent at Large, Foreign Correspondent, and Senior Writer for the Globe and Mail, where he won numerous national newspaper awards. And he currently sits on the board of the C.D. Howe Institute and World Literacy Canada. He's also a fellow of the Monk School, of which we're very proud, and I would now like to invite John to come up and say a few words about the deliberations of this quite remarkable jury. John.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, and good evening. It's an honor to represent this year's Gelber Prize jury. I've been asked to share some insights, as Stephen said, about the short list and the winner. But before I do that, I'd also like to recognize the Lionel Gelber Foundation and the Munk School of Global Affairs for their commitment to this award and making it a truly treasured celebration of foreign affairs writing. The world needs these books more than ever, one might argue, and therefore it needs this prize, which encourages and recognizes the writers behind them. Now, as Stephen said, this was a remarkable jury that spanned the globe from London to Sao Paulo to Washington to Tokyo. So as you can imagine, just finding an agreeable time for our conference calls was no easy feat. And I'm pleased to say the shortlist debate was more civilized than arranging the calls. But our process began in late fall when boxes of books arrived at each of our doorsteps. It's truly one of the great early holiday presents one can receive. And we each made our way through dozens of entries, focusing on each one's qualities in terms of authority, originality, significance, and readability. Yes, foreign affairs books should be page-turners. The world is far too interesting for anything less. Now, these five met the test, and I'll say a few words about each, starting with Hall of Mirrors. It's Barry Eichengreen's compelling study of two financial crises that served as bookends to an American century. Eichengreen takes us through the geopolitical thicket of monetary policy to find echo after echo after echo between 1929 and 2009. He shows how each crisis was preceded by politically convenient credit boom, a politically convenient credit boom that made preventative medicine all but impossible to swallow. And he documents how the inevitable costs were greater than anyone had anticipated. Hall of Mirrors presents a cogent case for both multilateralism and economic diplomacy. Next, we took on K. Now, mention that initial or whisper the full name of Neil Ferguson's latest subject, Kissinger. And you can send any dinner party into a tizzy. We discovered book juries are no different. Our jurists all thought they knew Kissinger, some of them very well. Peace seeker, war maker, celebrity diplomat, White House confidant. We were impressed that Ferguson strove to portray the man as something else, an idealist. With unfettered access to Kissinger's personal archives, Ferguson uses the great diplomat's words and recollections to describe America at each point, a turning point of Cold War history. It's hard to imagine any discussion of the past half-century of U.S. foreign policy without serious reference to Henry Kissinger, and it's hard to imagine any of those discussions now not referring to this book. From Foggy Bottom, our reading journey took us back in time to the fall of an empire. The end of Tsarist Russia, in the end of Tsarist Russia, Dominic Levin challenges anyone who is skeptical about the relevance of history, particularly as we observe the centenary of World War I. Now, if you believe the Great War was determined on the Western Front, Levin has news for you. It was first and foremost, he argues, an Eastern struggle between German and Russian empires. And it was over territory of land and mind that hangs over us still. From there, he takes us through a reverse spin cycle of history. A disconnected and self-serving elite in Moscow, a rapidly shifting world, an inward and chauvinistic people, the call of Kiev, and westward expansion. A century ago, a messianic Russia was ignored. In this immensely topical work of history, Levin explains why the world lived to regret that, and might again still. Now, in many ways, The Guardian's, Susan Peterson's commanding history of the League of Nations was a brilliant sequel to Tsarist Russia. The dawn of internationalism is Peterson's canvas as she portrays a world caught between hope and hubris. With impeccable new research, she takes us through the early mandates when the wealthiest nations believed they could govern, lead, or at least shape the less fortunate. The jury felt the book was not only a compelling read, it cautions us about the blind zeal that can accompany altruism. Now, as you may have noticed, these four finalists are all rooted in the past, some in the very distant past. Our jury discussed this, and we recognized it as a sign, of our particular time. For all the technological progress and social mobility that we enjoy today, a world that is racing toward the 2020s is in some ways still a captive of the 1920s. And so we should not, even as we discuss the present, think we can escape the past. Which brings me to our winner. Scott Shane's book is a rarity among foreign affairs titles and captured the imagination and admiration of everyone on the jury. Objective Troy seemed to be exactly what we were looking for. It flowed dramatically like a novel, carried the academic weight of a thesis, and laid out enough foreign policy dilemmas to fill a month of Sunday talk shows. This is the story of Americans and Arabs in the age of terror. Objective Troy's importance, though, lies in its sober examination of the Obama administration's response. Little else about the Obama years is as intellectually challenging, morally confounding, or politically ironic as its rapid adoption of drone warfare. Yet to date, no one has so directly, thoroughly, and fairly shone a light on it as Shane has. So there you have it, a book about the limits of multilateralism, another about the reach and limits of the great man, a third about the dangers of empire, and a fourth about the moral and intellectual boundaries of internationalism. And our winner, a book that people may read for years to come as they wonder about the odium of individuals, the power of technology to stop them, the folly of those at the controls, and the enduring challenge to democracy to keep it all in check. For our jury, Objective Troy is a consummate Gelber winner. Thank you.
Please, can I have a round of applause of thanks for the jury doing such a good job? I also want to take this opportunity to thank Samantha Smith, who has served as the guiding force within the Monk School in making sure that all of the organization was done, and it was done impeccably. So thank you, Samantha. It's now a true honor to introduce, finally, because I know you're all waiting to actually hear from him, the author of Objective Troy, Mr. Scott Shane, a reporter with the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. He's covered national security issues with the Times since 2004. He's written on recruiting by Islamic State, the National Security Agency and Edward Snowden's leaked documents, WikiLeaks and confidential State Department cables, the Obama administration's prosecution of leaks of classified information. I could go on. I want to say, though, that for me, and I've mentioned this to Mr. Shane, the writing that he did with his colleagues during the Bush administration in the debate over torture was quite defining. Truly great research, important reporting on very difficult subject matter that really made a difference. And it happens to be an area where I write, and I have profoundly benefited from the great reporting that he and his colleagues did. They were nominated for the Pulitzer for that work, and it was deserved. Previously, he was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun and its Moscow correspondent from 1988 to 1991. Scott Shane lives in Baltimore, Maryland, with his wife, Francie Weeks, who teaches English to foreign students, and they have 3 children. Please join me in congratulating and welcoming Scott Shane, writer of Objective Troy, the winner of the 2016 Lionel Gelber Prize. Welcome.
Thanks so much to Stephen, to John, to Sarah, to all who've made this possible, and to everybody who in this era sticks up for serious books. They need the support, I think. I come from a country that you may have heard of where we seem to be choosing our president based on insults to wives, scaremongering of various kinds, and egomania. We've heard about how warmly Canada welcomes refugees, and my wife asked me while I was here to just sort of look into the possibilities. So I'm trying to do that. I've greatly enjoyed my visit to Toronto. And I have to say that one reason I was extremely gratified and pleased to win this prize is that I actually have old ties to Canada. Since I was a teenager, my extended family has had a cottage on Lake Temagami. And so I have been stuck in many Toronto, sort of greater Toronto traffic jams in the 15-hour drive from my home Lake Temagami. And if next time you pass through on Highway 11, may I suggest that you stop at B&D's chip stand and order the fresh pickerel and poutine. You won't be sorry. So let me tell you a little bit about the origins of this book. I'll also be showing a few slides and a few video clips, and then we'll try and leave some time for questions. I had been a reporter, as Stephen mentioned, in Moscow in the last few years of Soviet power. I sort of watched things fall apart. And it was I'd studied Russian, I'd always been interested in Russian history. It was a great experience to be able to step back and write a book about that called Dismantling Utopia. And after spending many years covering terrorism and counterterrorism in the post 9/11 era, I was sort of looking for an opportunity to do the same thing. Just, a chance to think about something a little bit harder and find a way to tell a story that would capture some of the big issues in this era that has really been defined by the conflict between the West and a certain strain of Islam. We're now, into year 15, and the Cold War lasted for 40 years or so. I'm surprised to say that I'm now beginning to wonder whether this era will kind of rival that one. Although I think that the fears that are generated by terrorism in the West are often exaggerated, very much our fault in the media, and not to be compared with the dangers of nuclear annihilation during the Cold War. But they're real, and this was an opportunity to take a look at them. I wanted, among other things, to look at something that had perplexed me really since 9/11, which is what makes a terrorist. What brings a human being to the point that they dedicate their life to killing dozens or hundreds of strangers. And I wanted to find some way to make sense of that to the degree it was possible. And I also wanted to look at the counterterrorism side, and particularly at a peculiar feature of almost everything the U.S. has done since 2001 in counterterrorism, whether that is CIA interrogation and torture, whether that's Guantanamo, the prison at Guantanamo, whether it's the secret prisons and secret detention, whether it's the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, or more recently, drone strikes in the Obama administration. Whatever contribution these things have made to American security, they also have sort of had unintended consequences, generated a backlash, and weighed in on the other side of the scale, generating recruits to the cause of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And while I think the U.S. Is safer today than against a large, complicated terrorist attack on the scale of 9/11, I think there are probably more people who, in the world today, than there were in 2001, who believe the U.S. is at war with Islam and that it is religiously justified to carry out violence against the U.S. or against the West, in the name of Islam. And that's a worrisome thing, to put it mildly. So I wanted to look at those two things, and I also wanted to tell a story. This is actually a fantastically interesting period of history. It's a very kind of vexing, contradictory subject, and I wanted to try to make it accessible to readers. So I fastened on to the life and death of Anwar al-Awlaki, often pronounced Awlaki in the Western media, but his family pronounces it Awlaki, so I got in the habit of saying it that way. And I found that his story sort of spans the whole period. He had two of the 9/11 hijackers praying in his mosque in the year prior to 9/11, and even after his death, his material has been embraced and used by the Islamic State for propaganda purposes. So his story sort of stretches through across this whole era. It combines a wrenching father, son, grandson family drama, a personal story involving puritanical religion and hypocritical sexual escapades. It's got legal and moral wrangling at the highest levels of the US government. It's a spy story in which every tool of espionage was used. And I think it holds a lesson about ideological conflict in an era of social media. And Aoki had become a historic figure in two ways. One, as the leading recruiter, certainly in English, and maybe period, on behalf of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and its ideology, very much in Canada as well as in the US and Britain, and beyond. He's really become a brand in his own right, almost the way a sort of borderless brand like Apple or Toyota. This guy is a brand in violent jihad. And secondly, he became the first American citizen to be killed by his own government on orders of a president without a trial using a drone. The first American to be killed in that way, sort of executed without trial on the orders of a president since the US Civil War. So in that way, he made his mark in history as well. I come from an old, print newspaper culture, so this is a little bit unusual, but actually I'm going to show some videos and some slides because in this case, it's absolutely appropriate. This is a guy who I kind of came to realize as I researched the book, lived his entire professional life in front of audio and video recorders. And as we'll see, it's all still up there. So let me set the stage for the first clip. This is, Anwar al-Awlaki was born in 1971 in New Mexico. His father was a graduate student. And one of the ironies of this tale is that his father, Nasser, who later became the agriculture minister and chancellor of 2 universities in Yemen, loved the United States. He spent about a dozen years living in the States and greatly admired the US. He told me that his first fond memory of the US was arriving as a Fulbright scholar and being taken out to Kansas for English language training before he began his real studies, and finding in the cafeteria that he could have all the milk he could drink, which was sort of a wonder for a kid from Yemen. Anyway, so Anwar was born in New Mexico. At age 7, he returned to Yemen, or he went to Yemen with his parents who were returning home. And he stayed there from age 7 to age 19. His father sent him back to the States to get an engineering education, chose Colorado State University, and sent him there, and with the idea that he would get a kind of technical education and be able to come back to Yemen and help Yemen, a country with the same population as Saudi Arabia and much less money because much less oil. Poorest country in the Arab world, and now, as you know, engulfed in a terrible civil war. But it's definitely a country that could use help, and that was the idea that Anwar would come back someday as a young engineer and do his country some good. But as kids will, he had other ideas. He finished the engineering degree, but embraced religion for the first time, actually, in Colorado. He comes from a very religious, very conservative Muslim country, Yemen, where he has no interest in religion, comes to Colorado and embraces Islam in a big way. And so he also begins to preach in the little campus at the edge of the Colorado State campus and finds that he has a knack for preaching. And so while his father's pushing him into engineering, he's definitely headed in another direction. He took a job for, I think, 6 weeks as an engineer after college in Denver and then said, "Dad, I can't do it," and became a part-time, horribly underpaid imam at the Denver Islamic Society. He went on to be an extremely successful, charismatic young imam in three American cities, in Denver, then in San Diego, and then in January of 2001, moved to a large mosque in Northern Virginia, right across the river, Potomac River from Washington, one of Washington's biggest and most prominent mosques. So, kind of a big spotlight on him at that point. And when 9/11 hit, he was sort of the right man in the right place at the right time. And Americans suddenly wanted to know about Islam, about Al-Qaeda. And here was this guy with perfect Arabic, perfect English, a kind of nice, low-key manner, able to provide lucid explanations to these, to Americans. So he was suddenly being, besieged by news crews. He was in the Washington Post. He was in the New York Times. In fact, the New York Times described him as an imam who at 30 is held up as a new generation of Muslim leader capable of merging East and West. And during that period, when he was sort of emerging as a bit of a media star, the Washington Post asked him to let them follow him around all day with a video camera, and to do a little video explaining the holy month of Ramadan. And I'll just play a little clip from this. This is the guy I call the good Anwar. Just to give you a sense of who he was at the end of 2001, and actually who he might have been.
The morning meal, this is something that we do before the first break of light in the horizon. It's not even sunrise. It's before that.
This is in his basement of his little house in Falls Church, Virginia.
For us to get away from the worldly indulgence and everything that is material. It's a chance for us to have a more austere life. Muslims abstain from 3 things during the month of Ramadan: food, drink, and any sexual activity. And that is from sunrise to sunset. I would leave the mosque, come back home, get some rest. Actually, I would check my email first, and then get some rest. And then go to the midday prayer, which is the afternoon, 12:30. سمع الله لمن حمده. Allahu Akbar. I think that in general, Islam is presented in a negative way. I mean, there's always this association between Islam and terrorism, when that is not true at all. I mean, Islam is a religion of peace.
Okay, so I'll cut that off right there and repeat: Islam is a religion of peace. This is the early Alaki, the good Anwar. He had condemned 9/11. He had said in a sermon that the special role of Muslims in America was to be a bridge between the United States and 1 billion Muslims worldwide. And, that was the line that he was taking. There was a question of whether he was sincere. My reporting suggests that he basically was. I got his emails that he'd exchanged with his younger brother at the time, and they were saying the same thing. He described 9/11 as horrible. So I actually think he believed what he was saying, but he was also a very ambitious guy, and I think he realized this was working for him. He had, a very promising career as a public figure ahead of him. He preached at the U.S. Capitol. He was a luncheon speaker at the Pentagon, and he was really on a roll. Now, his life took some unexpected turns, and you'll have to read the book to get the details. But I would say just briefly that there were some personal things that happened, and there were some external things that happened. There was something that came up that forced him to leave the United States in a hurry, and sort of shattered the career path that he was on. And also during the same period of time, the U.S., if we think back, bin Laden had announced that the U.S. was at war with Islam in the 90s, which at the time seemed sort of a lunatic notion. What does he mean, the U.S. is at war with Islam? After 9/11, we invaded Afghanistan, we invaded Iraq. we opened a lot of prisons. We started carrying out drone strikes in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia. And I think it began to be a more sort of saleable notion, the idea that the U.S. was at war with Islam. And I think that also had an influence on this guy. So I'm going to fast forward through almost 9 years to March of 2010. And by now, Anwar al-Awlaki has turned decidedly radical. He's joined al-Qaeda in Yemen, and his influence is turning up via the internet in nearly every sort of terrorist arrest in the West, certainly in the English-speaking West, in a number of Canadian cases that undoubtedly you are aware of, including the so-called Toronto 18, in many American cases. And he's working full-time on plots against America, basically. He's praised as a hero, the kind of acolyte Nidal Hassan, an American Army psychiatrist who shot up Fort Hood, Texas, and killed 13 people. He helped kind of vet and coach and send the so-called underwear bomber, the young Nigerian who tried to blow up a plane over Detroit on Christmas Day in 2009. So he's sort of all in on this. And so this is March 2010, a few months after the failed underwear bomber plot. And he is issuing what is sometimes referred to as a call to jihad. He's dressed in camo gear with a traditional Yemeni tribal dagger in his belt. And he's changed his tune from the time when he would say that Islam is a religion of peace.
Do not be deceived by the promises of preserving your rights from a government that is right now killing your own brothers and sisters. Today, with the war between Muslims and the West escalating, you cannot count on the message of solidarity you may get from a civic group or a political party, or the word of support you hear from a kind neighbor or a nice co-worker. The West will eventually turn against its Muslim citizens. Hence, my advice to you is this. You have two choices, either hijrah or jihad. You either leave or you fight. You leave and live among Muslims, or you stay behind and follow the example of Nidal Hassan and others who fulfilled their duty of fighting for Allah's cause. I specifically invite the youth to either fight in the West or join their brothers in the fronts of jihad, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia. I invite them to join us in our new front, Yemen, the base from which the great jihad of the Arabian Peninsula will begin.
So, quite a transformation in those 9 years. And that was, what drew me to this guy's story, to try to understand that journey. By now, you won't be surprised that Anwar al-Awlaki had the full attention of the second main character of my book, Barack Obama. And let me digress for a moment to talk about a curious parallel between the early lives of Barack Obama and Anwar al-Awlaki. May seem like a strange comparison, and in the end it was, but they both were born to fathers of Muslim ancestry who had come to the United States for grad school. They both were taken overseas to Muslim countries as children. Anwar going back to Yemen with his parents, Barack Obama's mom taking him to Indonesia. They both then returned to the United States, the land of their birth. And they both, I think as part, as a reflection of this kind of unusual background, they both struggled with identity. Barack Obama wrote a best-selling book called Dreams from My Father, very much about his struggle with identity. And, if you haven't read it, it's a great book, but he actually describes the temptation of radicalism as a young man, the sort of temptation as a young black man in America of militancy, what he describes as withdrawing into a smaller and smaller coil of rage until one lashes out. It's a very memorable description. But he rejected that path, obviously, sort of embraced America and soon vaulted to the very top of the political system. Anwar al-Awlaki followed a different path. And, but it's, if you think about if this story had unfolded in the administration of George W. Bush, there would be no parallel whatsoever between these guys. It's just, kind of a reflection on the contingency of anyone's life and the kind of twists and turns that end up shaping where someone ends up. So when Barack Obama became president, campaigning against many of George W. Bush's counterterrorism programs, a lot of his fans and actually a lot of his critics were surprised that he came to embrace the drone. This now famous image of the Predator drone with the Hellfire missiles hanging underneath it, which has kind of come to define this new era of warfare. But Obama, when I looked at his history, I found that he actually had given numerous signals that he had, a great interest in this counterterrorism tool. He's really a pragmatist. He's not an ideologue of left or right. And, he had said famously in a speech denouncing and speaking out against the planned invasion of Iraq in 2002, he had said repeatedly a refrain that got less attention, which was, he was not against all wars, he was against dumb wars. And I think by the time he was elected president, he had come to see Afghanistan and Iraq as dumb wars, extremely costly in lives, extremely costly financially, and with very equivocal outcomes in terms of American security. And he thought that the drone was actually the right weapon for a widely scattered, not very numerous terrorist group. And he often told aides, let's try to kill the people who are trying to kill us. And so he liked this. This is a guy also who came into office and didn't want to give up his BlackBerry. He's sort of a techno guy, and he thought this was the solution to the problem. So facing Anwar al-Awlaki, often at that time considered to be the biggest single threat to the United States, bin Laden was hiding, as it turned out, in his sort of rundown mansion. Al-Awlaki was very active and seemed to be the most significant terrorist threat to the United States at that time. So he asked the Justice Department to look at whether it would be legal and constitutional to kill this guy as an American citizen. And the answer came back that it would be. And he went on the kill list. And that brings me to the title of my book, which I often forget to mention. If you have the great misfortune to be put on the American military kill list, you become an objective and you're given a code name. And this guy was called Objective Troy. And at first I thought maybe Troy was a kind of, maybe there was someone in the bowels of the Pentagon with a literary band who was thinking of the Trojan horse and betrayal from within. But it turns out that the military chose the names of targets in Yemen from a list of towns in the state of Ohio. And so Anwar al-Awlaki was named Objective Troy after the small town of Troy, Ohio. What happened then is, there are now 16 American intelligence agencies, believe it or not, and the 17th layer is the Director of National Intelligence above them. And they all are very motivated by orders from the president. And they all go out looking for this guy. And it took them almost a year and a half to find him. But eventually they did. They killed him they found him in the north of Yemen, fairly wild place, not too far from the Saudi border, and took him out with a volley of missiles that wiped out their SUVs and killed him, a young American acolyte named Samir Khan, and two Yemeni al-Qaeda guys who were with them on September 30th, 2011. So more than 4 years ago now. And so my two main characters, who never met in real life, kind of meet symbolically, in this sort of desert in the north of Yemen. And for a while, I remember this vividly because I had to write about all this stuff, Obama and his people and the counterterrorism agencies, people were sort of doing a little victory lap. They had killed Osama bin Laden in May of 2011. Now they had killed Anwar al-Awlaki in September of 2011. They did them both without invading the country, a new country, Yemen, Pakistan, with 100,000 American troops. So they were pretty pleased with themselves, and they got actually a lot of positive press attention at the time. And it lasted, that good feeling lasted for about 2 weeks because something happened that cast a shadow over the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki. But before I get to that, I realize I'm getting a little out of order here. I want to, at the time, Obama gave a somewhat cryptic statement about al-Awlaki's death. Only 2 years later, in a big speech on drones in May of 2013, did he actually directly acknowledge how Anwar al-Awlaki died and explain why he gave that order. So let me play that first.
For the record, I do not believe it would be constitutional for the government to target and kill any U.S. citizen with a drone or with a shotgun without due process. Nor should any president deploy armed drones over U.S. soil. But when a U.S. citizen goes abroad to wage war against America and is actively plotting to kill U.S. citizens, and when neither the United States nor our partners are in a position to capture him before he carries out a plot, his citizenship should no more serve as a shield than a sniper shooting down on an innocent crowd should be protected from a SWAT team. That's who Anwar al-Awlaki was. He was continuously trying to kill people.
So that's sort of the centerpiece of his drone speech, and a cogent explanation for why he thought this was necessary. In that speech, he did not discuss what happened 2 weeks after the strike that killed Anwar al-Awlaki, which was another U.S. drone strike that killed 7 men on the ground in Yemen, 2 of whom turned out to be Anwar al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman, and his 17-year-old cousin. Some of the others may have been affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but the drone operators had no idea that al-Awlaki's teenage son, who had no history of terrorism, was there, or the 17-year-old, and they considered it to be, a big mistake, a disastrous mistake. Obama was furious when he got word about this because he realized that in Yemen that would have huge repercussions for the American reputation, for the reputation of the drone program, and for recruiting for Al-Qaeda. And indeed, when I went to Yemen to report the book in 2014, I found a lot of people who sort of accepted the idea that Anwar al-Awlaki got what was coming to him. It's a tribal place. They understand that if he was trying to kill the Americans and the Americans got him, there was some measure of justice involved. But the kid, they could not understand at all. By all accounts, he was a very sweet kid who, did not deserve this. And, you still, when I was there, you still saw posters of the 16-year-old around. So there were, huge consequences in this fundamentally ideological contest for hearts and minds. Something like that, has a big impact. So that was the first thing that changed, sort of cast a shadow over this whole affair. The second thing, well, and let me just show you. This is Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. He was also a U.S. citizen. He was born in Denver when his dad was an imam there. Died at age 16. So the second thing took longer to make itself felt, but essentially, what I think the administration had not fully realized, was that if you kill an internet guy in the age of the internet, he doesn't really go away. And so if you go on YouTube today, the other day I went on, and actually when I made this slide, I found 62,000 videos on YouTube with a search for Anwar al-Awlaki. Some of them are news stories about the drone strike that killed him. Some are other things. most of them are his life's work. From the 53 CD set he did on the life of the Prophet Muhammad in his early mainstream work as an imam, to the, Kill American stuff that I showed you a clip of, and a lot of stuff in between. It's all out there. It's all accessible at a click. This was a few months ago. I found 62,000 videos. A couple days ago, I checked again, came up with 71,000 videos. And I think it's partly the sort of jumble of stuff that makes him such a powerful recruiter for violent jihad, because he doesn't begin with that message. You can kind of learn the history of Islam. You can hear his lectures on the early heroes of Islam, sort of the equivalent of David versus Goliath, sort of inspiring history stories. You can hear lectures on the sanctity of marriage. You can hear lectures on obesity and overeating in Islam. You can hear lectures on almost everything. Then there's sort of the middle period where you can also hear his lecture on why a Muslim can never trust a non-Muslim. You can hear him talking about how the Fort Hood shooter, Nidal Hassan, and the underwear bomber, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, were heroes and role models. And you can hear how it's the religious duty of every Muslim to attack America. So he's still out there, but that's not the whole story. He's not just who he was when he was alive. He is now a martyr. Islam, like Christianity, has a very strong tradition of martyrdom. And so if you put martyr and Awlaki into the YouTube search engine, you find a lot of tributes to him as a martyr, and also his own sermons on martyrdom and the role of martyrdom in Islam. So he's sort of been promoted in death. So in case after case, since he was killed, he has turned up as a major influence. When the FBI or Canadian authorities or British authorities, as they always do, find the hard drive, find the laptop that was used by the person who either attempted some act of violence or was arrested and accused of attempting some act of violence, planning some act of violence, they'll find almost inevitably a long queue of Awlaki videos and audio recordings, as an influence. That was true in many cases you haven't heard of, and it was true in some cases you have heard of. The Chechen brothers who set off 2 bombs at the finish line of the Boston Marathon in 2013, the Tsarnaev brothers, huge fans of Anwar Awlaki, who got not only their ideology from him, but also from his English language magazine, Inspire, the Al-Qaeda magazine that he helped put out, their literal bomb-making instructions. They built bombs out of pressure cookers, and they worked, unfortunately, very well. The Charlie Hebdo shooters, not even English speakers, French, Algerian Frenchmen in Paris who attacked Charlie Hebdo, they were big fans, and one of them went to see Anwar when he was still alive in Yemen. There was a guy who killed 5 Marines in Chattanooga, Tennessee last summer, big fan of Anwar Awlaki. And most recently, that strange couple, the husband and wife, who went to the husband's sort of lunch work meeting and shot it up and killed 14 people in San Bernardino, California. They were both shot dead by police, but a neighbor who had conspired with the husband, told the police, told the FBI that he and Syed Farouk, the husband, had spent many hours watching and discussing Anwar Awlaki's videos. So he spoke from, he sort of speaks from beyond the grave with even greater authority than he had when he was alive. Let me show you one last video clip. This is just a sample. This is from the, I guess you could say, the official Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula eulogy video for Anwar Awlaki, which is up there. And it shows Awlaki sitting in a tent near the end of his life. He's speaking Arabic for a change and talking about martyrdom. And it's just give you a flavor of some of these tributes to him that have shown up on the web since his death, some of which are quite beautiful.
تظهر فيها الثمار وتنضج ويحين قطاف هذه الثمار.
He's talking just about
Wow.
martyrdom. The fruits of the tree of martyrdom are
عباد
ripening.
الله في مراحل حتى يصلوا إلى مرحلة آن الأوان أن يتخذوا شهداء. الله عز وجل يقول ويتخذ منكم شهداء. فشجرة الشهادة في الجزيرة العربية أينعت فيها ثمار، وحان وقت القطاف فاتخذ الله عز وجل من هؤلاء.
The time for reaping has come. So the martyr of Dawah is, sorry, you just saw that last frame there. He's described as the martyr of Dawah. Dawah is Islamic teaching. And you know, this is a half-hour video loaded with fantastic music, beautiful imagery, and just a really, you know, if you don't think too much about it, a very moving tribute to this guy. And that is out there, you know, for anybody who wants to see. So in the end, it's very clear that when the U.S. made this somewhat momentous decision to kill the messenger, it did not by any means kill the message. I want to make one more point, and I'll wrap up, and then I'd love to hear your questions or comments. And this is a sort of odd little symmetry that's hard to know what to make of, but you can take it home and think about it. I thought about calling this book not Objective Troy, but something else, Hellfire. My agent told me it sounded like a cheap thriller, and the next in the series would be Tomahawk. But the reason I thought about that name was that Anwar al-Awlaki preached endlessly about hellfire, which is basically what he said would be the fate, the inevitable fate, I suspect, of everybody in this room. In other words, everybody who did not embrace his version of Islam. And so he talked a lot about hellfire in great detail, as you know, as sort of preachers are wont to do. But when the U.S. came to kill him, it used a missile called the Hellfire. And, you know, that's an interesting coincidence. And you might think it was just a coincidence, but guess what the name of the missile is that's now being loaded on drones and is replacing the Predator? It's called the Brimstone. And guess what the bigger drone that now is sort of phasing out the Predator? It's called the Reaper. So you know, in a way, it sounds like both sides in this conflict want to see kind of religious apocalyptic meaning in our strikes, whether they're done with a pressure cooker or a Hellfire missile. We all seem to believe that God is on our side, and that may be a dark sign of what's ahead. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and thanks again for this prize.
Great. Well, thank you very much for, I think, giving us a flavor. For those of you who've not yet had the chance to read the book, it's a wonderful interweaving of the stories of al-Awlaki, of President Obama, and of all of the challenges around the existence of the drone and of targeted killing. We've already got a few questions. Thank you very much. So the first maybe is to focus more on the drone question than you have. You focused a lot in the talk on al-Awlaki, or al-Awlaki. One of the people here has asked whether or not what we can derive from the use of these drones is that law has almost no role to play, that it's purely fungible. We are not really worried about due process or procedures. And yet, in American history, due process is a hugely important figure of constitutionalism. And yet, despite President Obama's characterization in the clip that you gave, there seems to be a sense in which this is outside of law or extrajudicial. Any comments on what you learned as you were researching the book?
Sure. We're going to share the microphone, I guess. I mean, I'll tell you what Obama would say if he were here. He would say that due process does not mean judicial process. It means the process that someone is due under the law. And that, as you see in the police shooting analogy, some guy who takes a gun and aims it at a crowd of innocent people does not get a trial. The police shoot him, and that's considered completely legal and constitutional. So he draws that analogy, and he says that essentially the very serious, very elaborate discussion, though secret, inside the Justice Department about the evidence against this man, the threat that he posed, the infeasibility of capture, as they described it, that all of that added up to due process, and that therefore he got due process, and that therefore this is not at all outside the law, it was carried out within the law. I'll just add one little fact to that, complicating fact, which is not being a lawyer myself, I sought the help of a friend, and we polled about 36 current and former constitutional law professors, American professors of constitutional law, and I asked them one question via email, which was it legal and constitutional for the US government to kill Anwar al-Awlaki? Yes, no, or it depends. And I think we got almost 36 responses, and they broke down almost one-third, one-third, one-third. One-third yes, legal, one-third no, illegal, and one-third it depends on the details. So it doesn't seem to be a settled question.
I think the next person is asking you to take off your reporter hat and to put on your op-ed writer hat, and to ask you what a smart strategic role for America would be in understanding how to deal with jihad when you think about problems like torture, when you think about the use of drones. Having struggled with this yourself in writing the book, what advice would you give to the US government?
Well, sometimes I thank my lucky stars that I'm a journalist and I don't have to decide any of this stuff. I can just write about it. I think people have often asked me, was it right or wrong to kill Anwar al-Awlaki? What do you think? And I often try to dodge that question and to say that I wanted to write a book. It was already a very polarizing issue in the States. I wanted to write a book that if you thought it was a wonderful thing that Obama had killed this guy, you would read the book and have second thoughts. And if you thought it was a terrible thing and a war crime that Obama had killed this guy and you read the book, you would have second thoughts. Because I think actually it's a very difficult decision. And I don't really have an answer for the bigger question. The only thing I'll say is sort of an observation, which is that the answer to a sort of bigoted and violent strain of Islam that the U.S. has faced for 15 years or longer, but certainly has been at the center of our attention for 15 years, and whose main recruiting claim is that the U.S. is killing Muslims, and that therefore it is the obligation, the religious obligation of other Muslims to come to their defense and attack America and defend the Ummah, the global community of Muslims. That is their core recruiting argument, both Al-Qaeda and now ISIS. And the answer from the U.S. in many ways has been killing Muslims. Set aside the fact that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have killed far more Muslims and so on, but still, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, drone strikes are all a kind of use of hardware. And a former CIA officer who worked on this problem for many years pointed out to me that the U.S. had basically used hard power in this conflict. And he wondered whether the country that had created Hollywood and Madison Avenue couldn't think more creatively about how to take on what's essentially an ideological enemy, an ideological conflict, and use some more imagination in that way. The U.S. government has dabbled in it, and it's it's difficult. The State Department had a anti-ISIS Twitter account called Think Again, Turn Away, that they've recently shut down, basically, because they thought it was ineffective. So, that's an interesting, provocative thought, that we ought to fight this with soft power. How you go about that is, the subject of a whole nother book, I think.
There's obviously at least one slightly frustrated person in the audience who wanted me to quote Seinfeld to say that you yada yada'd over what he thought was going to be the most exciting part of the talk, which is what did happen to Alaki to change his approach? You can't get into too much detail, but maybe a little more of the flavor.
Okay. I'll tell you. There are multiple turns in his story, but maybe the most surprising and perhaps most crucial one was his decision to leave the United States in a big hurry. And basically, that was what happened was because he'd had two of the 9/11 hijackers praying at his mosque in San Diego before 9/11, and one of those and another hijacker had shown up at his mosque in Virginia. There was deep concern in the panicky, weeks after 9/11 on the part of the FBI that maybe this guy was somehow in on the plot. He was part of Al-Qaeda. So they set surveillance on him 24 hours a day, started bugging his phones, following him around everywhere where he went. And I had to read hundreds and hundreds of surveillance logs, most of them very boring, about what Anwar was doing, what his wife was up to, they satisfied themselves within a couple of months that he had no connection to Al-Qaeda, that he had nothing to do with 9/11, that he was not a terrorist. But they also found that he had a regular habit of visiting prostitutes in Washington hotels every week or two. And this wasn't really their intent. They were following him, and that's where he went. And then they would talk to the women afterwards to see if he, blurted out anything about, a terrorist plot. And so this was all duly recorded in FBI files. And at one point, a woman who had been questioned by the FBI, understandably sort of freaked out, called her boss, her madam, and said, "Oh my God, they're asking me questions about this customer." And so the madam called Anwar. I actually heard a little bit more about this since I did the book, and she called him not really to tip him off, but more to yell at him to say, "Why are you bringing the FBI down on my business?" And he was horrified. He apparently was taken by surprise, and he realized that this would be a personal and professional, humiliation, disaster for him. Here's a guy who preaches to this conservative audience, mostly immigrants, about the sanctity of marriage. And among other things, he had a thundering sermon denouncing Hollywood and its lax morals. And so this would be predictable disaster. And his younger brother was visiting him at the time. I managed to get a document declassified and put together, the fact that this is what caused him to suddenly leave the U.S. He came back for one brief visit, but basically had to find a new life and a new career, which, alas, he did.
I'm afraid that we've run out of time, but I can remind you that if you'd like to hear more, and there are even a few other hints about the psychological development of Alaki, you can go online and listen to the podcast, which is sponsored by Focus Asset Management, and you can hear podcast interviews with the other nominated authors as well. I'd now like to invite Sarah Charney to come back to the podium to actually give the prize. We have to do that at some point. Thank you very much, Sarah.
It gives us great pleasure to award you this prize, albeit in Canadian dollars, my friend, but
we may need them depending on how things go.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Well, that draws the proceedings to a close, but I want to thank all of you for joining us for the 2016 award of the Lionel Gelber Prize, and once again to thank Scott Shane for really an illuminating, and I have to say a troubling talk. If there's anything that one could conclude from this, it is that the world is an extraordinarily complex and sometimes quite upsetting place. And despite the great books that are written, we haven't sorted it all out yet. So thank you for joining us, and please come and join us for a reception immediately afterwards. Thank you very much.